to liftoff and the clock has started. Yes, sir. Reading you loud and clear.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Discovery, roger, go ahead,
Good evening and welcome to the September 18, 2019 edition of Space News. This is Peter Aylward and I have Tina Stagg and Michael Abdillah here with me tonight. We are all from the Space Association of Australia. So let's get started with some more space news. Aussie space entrepreneur Adam Gilmore has been recognised for advanced manufacturing. Gilmore, the chief executive and founder of space company Gilmore Space Technologies, has been awarded this year's Advance Award for Advanced Manufacturing. The Advance Awards acknowledge Australians whose work is making an impact around the world and span technological innovation to social impact, healthcare and the arts. The Advance Award for Advanced Manufacturing recognises Gilmore's entrepreneurial streak, co-founding and operating one of Australia's new wave of startups in the booming space sector. Gilmore Space Technologies has partnered with the University of Southern Queensland to develop new rocket technology, including space-grade composite materials. In 2015, Adam Gilmore quit a 20-year banking career to pursue his lifelong passion for space. Working in Singapore, he founded Gilmore Space Technologies with his brother James. Now, the company is based on the Queensland Gold Coast and is one of Australia's leading space companies with over 40 employees. Gilmore has developed a hybrid rocket with 3D printed fuel, with the aim of developing a lower cost satellite launch capability. But we'll keep an eye on that one. And over in New Zealand, Rocket Lab tempers expectations of reusable rockets' first attempt. Rocket Lab founder New Zealander Peter Beck says the company has done substantial work on making its rockets recoverable and reusable, but Beck says we shouldn't expect them to get it right on the first attempt. Rocket Lab has now successfully launched 8 of its Electron rockets from its New Zealand launch facility, with recovery possibly to be attempted after the next 2 launches, with launch 9 scheduled for later this month. Beck said there would be some significant changes to the vehicle for launch 10, but he continued, it's really hard to predict when we're going to have the first fully fledged recovery attempt. Since much of the cost of a launch is in single-use components, Rocket Lab is aiming to recover the Electron rocket first stage, which would initially be slowed by Ballute, a high-altitude braking device, then by parachute, then snatched during descent by a helicopter skyhook. Recovering the Electron first stage would also allow more frequent launches. Well, there you go. Over to space policy and Tina.
Thanks, Peter, and good evening, space fans. The White House is putting new pressure on Congress to accept its views on establishing a space force. The White House released a letter that was recently sent to leadership of the House and Senate Armed Services Committees about its concerns with their versions of a defence authorisation bill. The letter noted that the Senate bill in particular, quote, does not provide the necessary legislative authority to establish the United States Space Force as the 6th branch of the armed forces, unquote. The letter seeks other changes in language about the Space Force, including removing restrictions on transfer of personnel between branches of the military. The White House also objected to a separate section that gives the Missile Defence Agency authority for new missile warning satellites, arguing that it undermines ongoing efforts by the Space Development Agency. To NASA's Moon program, a NASA safety panel said it was encouraged by the progress it's seeing the agency making on Artemis, but warned about a perceived leadership vacuum. Members of the Aerospace Safety Advisory Panel, meeting recently, said they were particularly impressed at the speed at which NASA was moving ahead on various contracts for elements of the Artemis program. The panel expressed its optimism that NASA could achieve the goal of a human lunar landing by 2024 if adequately funded. The panel, though, noted the absence of a permanent associate administrator for human exploration and operations since the reassignment of Bill Gerstenmaier nearly 2 months ago, concluding it was imperative to have a successor in place to confirm the agency's approach for Artemis. Meanwhile, an increased interest in the moon has renewed debate about the legal regime for space resources. A committee of the NASA Advisory Council meeting recently worked on recommendations calling on NASA to work with other US government agencies on views about legal rights to extract and use resources in space. The committee specifically cited the importance of lunar water ice to the agency's plans to return to the moon sustainably. 2015 US law gave American companies the rights to resources they extract from celestial bodies based on the interest in asteroid mining, but views in other countries about such rights are mixed. A United Nations committee will set up a working group next year to study what the legal regime should be for space resources. And turning to other military and US defence news, the Air Force has re-awarded a small launch vehicle contract that originally went to Vector. The Air Force Space and Missile Systems Centre, or SMC, recently awarded a $4.9 million contract to AVM for a mission called Aslon 45. As reported here on Space News at the time, SMC awarded that contract in early August to Vector, 3 days before the company announced a pause in operations because of financing problems. Subsequently, Vector withdrew from the contract in late August. AVM says it is working on an autonomous aircraft that can be used to launch small sats, but the company appears to still be in the early stages of development of that system. And to Michael.
Thank you, Tina, and let's move to Russia. Russia says it will use the RD-180 engine in a new version of the Soyuz rocket. Roscosmos head Dmitry Rogozin said the Soyuz 6, a medium-class rocket based on the Soyuz 5 already under development, will use the RD-180 engine, but didn't state when that vehicle would be ready. The RD-180 currently powers the Atlas V, which will be phased out in the 2020s as United Launch Alliance transitions to its new Vulcan rocket. And moving to China. China could return the Long March 5 heavy-lift rocket to flight before the end of the year. The rocket has not flown since its second launch in July 2017 ended in failure because of the malfunction of one of its first stage engines. If China does conduct a Long March 5 launch in 2019, it likely will be late in the year because of the time needed to transport the vehicle to the launch site and perform pre-launch preparations. The Long March 5 is needed for a number of major Chinese missions, including the Chang'e 5 lunar sample return mission and its first Mars lander, expected to launch in 2020. And let's take a look at Indian space news. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, or LRO, will attempt to observe India's Chandrayaan-2 lander later this week. LRO will pass over the predicted landing site of the Vikram spacecraft, and the mission will share any images it takes with the Indian Space Agency ISRO and the general public. While reports claim that Chandrayaan-2 orbiter has observed the lander, ISRO has yet to release any such images and has provided few updates in general about the status of the lander since it attempted to touch down on the moon more than a week ago. Meanwhile, the head of the Indian Space Agency is reportedly telling scientists and engineers to move on from the Vikram lunar lander. Agency sources said K. Sivan told staff last week that ISRO needs to move on to future missions after not hearing from the Vikram lander as it attempted to land on the moon. ISRO continues efforts to contact the lander, but only has until the end of next week before the solar-powered lander goes into a 2-week lunar night. And moving to Japan. Japan scrubbed last week's scheduled launch of an ISS cargo spacecraft when a fire broke out on the pad during pre-launch preparations. The fire started about 3.5 hours before the launch on the mobile platform used for the H2 rocket launches. The Japanese space agency JAXA and MHI, which manufactures the rocket, provided few details about the extent of damage to the pad and whether the H2B rocket was also affected. They did not announce a new launch date, but the launch is expected to be postponed by at least several days. And looking at South Korea. South Korea has postponed its first lunar mission from 2020 to 2022. The country's science ministry said the lunar orbiter mission, previously scheduled for launch in December 2020, will now fly in July 2022. Growth in the mass of the spacecraft to be launched on a SpaceX Falcon 9 has been an issue. The South Korean government first proposed the lunar orbiter mission more than a decade ago, but its launch date has fluctuated from administration to administration since then. And back to Tina.
Thanks, Mike. Turning to commercial space news, small sat launch companies are feeling pressure from competition to lower prices. Representatives of several companies, speaking on a conference panel last week, said price is an important factor for customers, including for dedicated launch providers who focus more on schedule and orbit flexibility. SpaceX's recent announcement of small-sat rideshare services at prices as low as $1 million for a 200-kilogram satellite had added to that pricing pressure recently, companies said. And in SpaceX news, the Japanese billionaire who bought a SpaceX Starship trip around the moon last year has sold his fashion company. Yahoo Japan will take a 50.1% stake in Zozo for $3.7 billion, including buying some of the shares owned by founder Yusaku Maezawa, who will step down as CEO. SpaceX announced a year ago that Maezawa would buy a flight of the Starship vehicle SpaceX is developing, sending it around the moon with several artists on board. Maezawa said that by stepping down from Zozo, he can spend more time preparing for the flight. SpaceX President Gwynne Shotwell says the company could launch as many as 24 Starlink missions next year. During a World Satellite Business Week panel discussion, Shotwell said the company plans to average 2 launches of Starlink satellites per month next year, and as many as 4 before the end of this year, depending on which of the company's other customers are ready to launch. SpaceX has performed 10 launches so far this year, and Shotwell estimates the company will do 7 to 8 more before the end of the year. And SpaceX is proposing a change in the design of its constellation of Starlink satellites. In an FCC filing, SpaceX proposed to increase the number of orbital planes for the constellation from 24 to 72. The company said this will increase launch efficiency and allow it to start services in the continental United States in perhaps half as many launches. SpaceX, which launched its first 60 Starlink satellites in May, said in a filing it expects to carry out several more Starlink launches before the end of this year. And back to Mike.
Thanks, Tina. And let's move on to Blue Origin. A planetary scientist best known for leading a Mars rover mission is joining Blue Origin. Steve Squires, a Cornell University professor of planetary science, will be the chief scientist for Blue Origin, the company said last week. Squires was the principal investigator for the Mars exploration rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. Before being hired by Blue Origin, he served on a science advisory board for the company as it planned development of its Blue Moon lunar lander. And back to Peter.
And to other space news, astronomers have discovered that what they believe is another comet that came from outside of the solar system. Comet 2019 Q4, discovered by astronomer Gennady Borisov in Crimea at the end of August, appears to be on a hyperbolic trajectory originating from outside of the solar system. The comet will pass through the inner solar system in December before escaping the local system. If its orbit is confirmed with upcoming observations, it will be only the second interstellar comet discovered since the first one back in 2017. And finally tonight, astronomers have found a planet in a star's habitable zone with evidence of water in its atmosphere. But don't make your travel plans just yet. The planet K218b orbits its star at a distance where liquid water could exist, and spectral data from the Hubble Space Telescope showed evidence of water vapour. While some scientists called the exoplanet the best candidate for habitability that we know right now, others cautioned the planet, about 8 times the mass of the Earth, is more like a mini Neptune versus a super Earth with a dense hydrogen atmosphere that could form a layer of liquid hydrogen. Well, we'll keep an eye on that planet, and if we need to get over there, we'll make our travel plans. That's it for this week. Thank you, Mike and Tina, and we'll speak with you next week.